So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the organisers and to Matt for chairing. And yeah, thanks in advance to Mike, who's going to be responding to me in about 45 minutes or so. Okay, so the title of the talk is Perceptual Media and Other Minds. Although in hindsight, there won't be much discussion of other minds, but more specifically, expressions of emotion. So to start with, I'd like to invite you to think about the following example, in which you know the emotion of another person. So imagine, as you are, sitting in the audience at a conference, watching the next speaker get ready. Their shoulders are tense, their eyes are darting around, and their hands are shaking slightly as they grip their notes. You know that they're nervous, and it seems reasonable to suppose that the way in which you know that they're nervous has something to do with their expressions of nervousness. It has something to do with their tense shoulders, their darting eyes, and their shaking hands. And this is where the main question behind my talk comes in. So what role do expressions play in this example? In other words, what epistemological role do expressions play in our knowledge of others' emotions? And I think broadly construed, two main options have come up in the literature so far. So one is to think of expressions as evidence for our taking people to be in particular emotional states. We have perceptual access to expressions, but we don't have it to mental states themselves. And so you see the speakers shaking hands, and you come to know that they're nervous on the basis of some evidence by, for instance, some sort of post-perceptual inference. However, one problem with this idea is that it seems to not respect the phenomenology. So here are two quotations to bring this out. So the first from Scheller, but that experiences occur in other people is given for us in expressive phenomena. Again, not by inference, but directly as a sort of primary perception. It is in the blush that we perceive shame, in the laughter, joy. And then another quote from Hegel, the spirit and the soul shine through the human eye, through a man's face. And these remarks seem to urge us towards a different picture. Quotes like these inspire some to offer a perceptual account of how we can know others' minds. So in particular, I want to look at a strong way to formulate a perceptual model, where we don't just get perceptual knowledge of another's emotion by just perceiving any old thing, but rather we get it from perceiving the emotion itself. So in this way, some have suggested that this is analogous to our paradigmatic perception of ordinary things around us. So we know the speaker's nervous by perceiving their nervousness itself, just as we know that there's a fox outside by perceiving its reddish-brown colour. But here's a worry based on thinking about how expressions are going to figure in this picture. And I think this is nicely brought up by McNeill. He says, what comes natural to us is to say that we see emotions, but only in people's expressions or behaviours. And this suggests a level of perceptual indirectness that doesn't intuitively hold between us and common objects or their colours. And it suggests a mediating role for people's expressions and other behaviours for which there is no analogue in central cases of perceptual awareness or knowledge. And I've put that in bold because it's really the main claim I want to push back on today. So the worry is that while it may be that we perceive emotions, such perception is only ever going to be disanalogous to paradigmatic cases of perception, since we perceive emotions via expressions. In comparison, we typically don't perceive a physical object by perceiving something else. So to generate this worry, what role are expressions being assumed to play? So the following quote from Smith, I think, is helpful. He says, proponents of the perceptibility of emotion must claim that one can perceive an emotion in virtue of perceiving its expression, despite the fact these aren't identical. This is to say that there's a sense in which the perception of others' emotions must be indirect. One sees someone's fear in virtue of seeing their facial or other bodily expression. So I think that this suggests the following kind of role for expressions, and I'm going to call this role perceptual intermediaries. So perceptual intermediaries mediate our awareness of other things by being that with which we're directly aware. This direct awareness of the perceptual intermediary somehow affords us indirect perceptual awareness of the object it mediates. So the indirect realist with respect to other minds holds that emotions are only ever perceived by perceiving expressions, just as some would claim that we are only ever aware of physical objects by being aware of something like sense data. Okay, so back to our overall question, we have two proposals: expressions are evidence or they're perceptual intermediaries. And if they're perceptual intermediaries, then we have the following asymmetry. We have perceptual knowledge that the speaker is nervous because we both perceive the speaker's nervousness by perceiving their shaking hands, versus we have perceptual knowledge that the fox is there because we just perceive the reddish-brown color of the fox. Okay, so while seeing something by seeing something else can capture the intuition that our knowledge of others' emotions is in some sense perceptual, it doesn't seem to capture what's going on in the phenomenological remarks I made before, the ones from Scheller and Hegel. To see something by seeing something else is importantly different to seeing something in or through something else. In the former, we perceive two things. We perceive the perceptual intermediary and the object that it affords us perceptual awareness of. In the latter, we're directly aware of the object of our awareness in or through something which is transparent to us. Okay, so to bring this out, I want to suggest that there's a third option for how we can understand the epistemic role of expressions. As opposed to thinking of expressions as evidence or perceptual intermediaries, we can understand them as playing an analogous role to perceptual media. Illumination and sound are examples of perceptual media. They enable perception such that without illumination or light, I wouldn't be able to see the color of the fox at the end of the road. And without sound, I wouldn't be able to hear its activity. Crucially, we see or hear things through or in perceptual media. And as will be spelled out later, in our perceptual experience of objects through media, the media may contribute to our perceptual awareness, but they're not the objects of it. And importantly, in responding to the asymmetry worry just sketched, perceptual media are enablers of perception that are indeed present in our paradigmatic perceptual cases. Okay, so for the most part in this paper, I'm just going to be drawing an analogy between expressions and the paradigmatic examples of media, sound, and illumination. And in doing this, I hope to motivate our taking expressions to play the following epistemic role in our awareness of others' emotions. Expressions allow the emotions of others to shine through, such that we are directly perceptually aware of them. We can capture the intuition that we see emotions in the expressions of others without having to suggest an asymmetry between this and paradigmatic cases of perceptual knowledge. We see joy in laughter, sadness in tears, and nervousness through trembling hands, just as we see the color of foxes through illumination. Okay, so now we have the setup. The plan is as follows. I'm going to first introduce perceptual media, and in particular, I'm going to focus on two key features of media, which is their role in perceptual constancy and their transparency. After this, I'm going to very briefly introduce expressions, and then for the rest of the talk, I'll be drawing an analogy between expressions and media, particularly with respect to constancy and transparency. Okay. So what are perceptual media? My understanding here is going to draw heavily on work from Mark Haldron and Vivian Mizrahi, who have both recently highlighted this underappreciated phenomenon. So firstly, they're distinct from a related notion, which I'll call physical or causal media. So imagine seeing a fox on the street outside your window. We might ask, how is it that you can see the fox, given that it lies some distance away from you? That is, how does it causally affect you? And we can posit various physical media in order to answer this and explain the causal story. For instance, the particles in the air, the window, your eyes, these are all things that causally play a role in your seeing the fox. And the physical media that will be relevant will change depending on the perceptual situation that you're in. So perceptual media are understood slightly differently. As Calderon puts it, while physical media merely answer the demands of being a causal intermediary, the idea of perceptual media answer to the demands of perceptual accessibility. So illumination and sound are the key enablers of perceptual accessibility, since in almost all cases, we cannot see and hear things without them. The propagation of light waves, the illumination, is what enables one to have visual experience of the fox. And the sound, the pattern disturbance to the medium between oneself and the source of sound, is what enables our auditory experience of the activities of objects. And I just want to flag at this point that I'm just going to be assuming an account of hearing in which the objects of our auditory perception are the sources of sounds rather than sounds themselves. Okay, so far we've said that perceptual media enable perception such that without them things wouldn't be seen or heard. But this doesn't provide a sufficient characterization just yet. So it's going to be helpful for us to pick out a couple of their key features. And for our purposes, I want to focus on ones that are relevant to how they operate in our perceptual experience. Okay, so the two that we'll look at today are, again, their role in perceptual constancy and their transparency. So to start with perceptual constancy, here's an image I captured earlier of my reading a book under a lamp in a room that's dimly lit by an overhead light. So here there are two illuminants. We have the lamp and the overhead light. This causes variation in the illumination before me. And as you can see in the photo, the top corner of the paper is brightest and the other end kind of falls under shadow. But this variation in illumination isn't necessarily mirrored in the perceived color. There's still a sense, looking at this, that you'd want to say that the pages are a uniform white color, despite the changes in brightness. The perceived color remains fairly constant, despite change to the medium. But on the other hand, the color appearance does admit of some kind of change. The apparent whiteness of the paper changes. It appears as different shades of gray depending upon where we look. So as Hilbert says, the printed page looks both similar and different when viewed under different illuminations, but not because there are multiple apparent colors associated with it. We just take it to be white. So a change to the perceptual medium sometimes invokes a phenomenon involving both change and stability, where the object's color appears to stay the same despite differences in color appearance. And we can observe something similar to go on with our auditory perception. So here I'm going to read a quote from Calderon. Consider approaching a continuous source of sound such as a waterfall. The waterfall, heard from different distances, sounds different. Heard from afar, the waterfall sounds quieter than it does when heard from nearby. As the perceiver approaches the waterfall, the sound of the waterfall increases in volume. But throughout the perceiver's approach, the perceiver heard the constant flowing of the waterfall. The flowing of the waterfall isn't experienced as getting louder, so much as the perceiver is getting in a better position to hear just how loud the waterfall really is. So here again, we've got variation in the medium, the sound, whilst the object of perception remains stable. And yet we have a sense of change with regards to its auditory appearance. So for another example, imagine someone who's shouting down the phone at you. As a result of this, you kind of hold the phone a little further away from your ear. You still hear them shouting just as loudly, but also it's quieter from your adjusted position. That's why you held it further away. Okay, so we've briefly considered color constancy, or constancy more generally. And next up, we have transparency. Okay, so perceptual media are transparent. Transparent things are perceptually penetrable, such that we see through or in them. And examples of transparent things include air, water, glass, and crystals. We see the sky and the trees outside through windows, and we see fish swimming in water. Both Calderon and Mizrahi appeal to Aristotle when explaining how it is we perceive transparent things. So Aristotle says, now, there is clearly something which is transparent, and by transparent I mean what is visible and yet not visible in itself, but rather owing its visibility to the colour of something else, Of this character are air, water, and many solid bodies. So transparent things are in some sense perceptible, but not in and of themselves in the way we'd usually understand ourselves to perceive things. So how does this kind of notion of perceptibility play out with respect to sound and illumination? If these are transparent, how is it that they feature in our experience? So when seeing through or in a transparent thing, the character of that thing is present in the way objects are presented through or in it. So imagine turning up the brightness of the lamp on your desk. Rather than saying we see the illumination get brighter, it seems more natural to think that the objects on your desk are now more brightly seen. Returning to the waterfall, Calderon emphasizes the way in which the medium is present in that experience. He says, hearing the sound of the waterfall from a given auditory perspective may be implicit. It may be recessive and in the background, so it doesn't compete for attentive resources directed towards the flowing of the waterfall. But it contributes to the conscious character of the perceiver's auditory experience by being the way in which the distal process is presented in that experience. So a very transparent medium is still phenomenologically significant in the sense that it's the way in which something is seen or heard. The experience is felt to be had from a particular point of view. We're aware of the medium, but only in the background of our experience. Okay, so one thing to point out is that things aren't always very transparent. An immaculately clean window is more transparent than one covered in dirt. And when the window is highly transparent, it features in your experience phenomenally, it features less. It might be so clean that you're not even aware of it at all, and you walk straight into it. The dirty window, however, is less transparent, and so you're more aware of its own perceptible properties. And this, I think, brings out that transparency comes in degrees. And these degrees of transparency are found in sound and illumination as well. Sounds can be recessive and in the background of our experience, but they can also make their way into the foreground. I hear the bird outside through the sound of birdsong, but it may be one day that I'm struck by just how lovely the sound of the birdsong is, and I start attending to it more in and of itself. The sound of the birdsong in this case becomes less transparent the more I focus on it. And we might say that something stops being a perceptual medium altogether when I no longer see or hear through it, but rather it comes into view as the primary object of my perception. Once it does this, it stops being transparent and thereby stops being a medium. Illumination as well can be a better or worse medium depending on its transparency. We can describe it as being less transparent on a foggy day, for example. When I go for a walk on a foggy day, I kind of tend to be more aware of the light around me. I'm aware of it being dim or clouded, and in turn, the things I see through it are harder to discern. And these cases, I think, bring out a crucial feature of media, which is that as their transparency decreases, as does our perceptual access to the objects seen through them. Okay, so we have things in place now to start motivating the idea that expressions play the same epistemological role as perceptual media. So to start with, we need an understanding of what expressions are. And this isn't as easy to answer as it may first appear, given disagreement in the literature over how to delineate emotional expressions. So I'm just going to try and cheat and sidestep this issue and not make any big claims as to what expressions are, but just think about them on a case-by-case basis. There are certain behavioral, facial movements, facial actions, configurations that at least some of us recognize as emotional expressions. Wrinkling one's nose in disgust, sighing with relief, cheering with happiness, and frowning in disappointment are the sorts of things we tend to describe. But I do want to make two assumptions about expressions. The first is simply that they're not identical to emotions. We may express sadness through tears, but it isn't fully constituted by them, or at least not many people seem to take this kind of behaviorism that seriously these days. And if there were no distinction here, then perceiving expressions would just be to perceive the emotion in an uncontroversial way. The second assumption is that emotions must be expressed to be perceptible. And I take this to be an assumption behind most theories of the perceptibility of emotion. They may disagree on how exactly expressions relate to emotions, be they parts or manifestations or effects. And so they may disagree on how we perceive one by perceiving the other. But most take it that at least they need to be expressed in order for any perceptual model to get off the ground. Okay, and this highlights the first point of comparison with perceptual media. In just the same way that one's ability to visually make out their car in the dark depends on some degree of light, our ability to make out someone's feelings depends on some degree of expression. Expressions are analogous to sound and illumination in that they are necessary for the perception of that which they mediate. Okay, so now we're going to think about whether expressions share features with perceptual media with respect to these two things, constancy and transparency. Before we saw with color constancy that variation in the perceptual media isn't necessarily tracked in our identification of what's seen through it. And I think strikingly in our awareness of others' emotions, something similar can be observed. Okay, so I'm going to read this quite chunky quote from Fritz Heider's 1958 book, Psychology of Interpersonal Relations. So he says, "The term constancy phenomenon is usually applied to the perception of color, brightness, size, and shape. But it's also applicable in the social perception of such crucial distal stimuli as wishes, needs, beliefs, abilities, affects, and personality traits. If we assert that wish constancy is possible just as there is size, shape, or color constancy, that means we recognize a wish as being the same in spite of its being mediated by different cues. The same wish may be conveyed, for example, by an innumerable variety of word combinations, ranging from "I want that" to the lengthy and complicated reflections transmitted to a therapist in a psychoanalytic session. Or the same wish may be conveyed by a colorful array of actions, as when a child, wanting a red wagon above all else, goes up and takes it, pushing a competing child from it, and even angrily kicks it in a fit of frustration. And I still haven't figured out whether he kicks the child or the wagon. So Heider emphasizes here how we can recognize the same underlying mental states despite a range of changes occurring in the medium. That is, differences in the way such mental states are conveyed. So imagine the following example. Your friend Michael, who's played here by Donald Glover, has just found out he didn't get the job he applied for. Over the course of the next few hours, he cycles through a series of expressions. To begin with, he just has a kind of glum look on his face. He starts staring at the ground. He then goes through a phase of kind of shaking his head and gives you some knowing looks. And then finally, he just gives up and puts his head in his hands on the table. A little bit later, your mutual friend Imogen comes into the room, and she did get the job, and Michael knows this. And here, Michael's expression changes again. He is gracious and he congratulates Imogen with a big smile. So despite such variation, Michael still looks like he's disappointed throughout all of this. There's a sense in which his emotion appears constant. See here for another example. Nadal has just lost and he's clearly been expressing severe disappointment. But here he tries to pull it together and look happy for Federer. But the disappointment still clearly shines through. But as with perceptual constancy, the variation in the medium, here the expression, doesn't involve a phenomenon completely devoid of appearance change. The way the disappointment appears changes through the differences in expression. It looks different when expressed differently in these two photographs. In this way, we have a phenomenon involving both stability of change, mediated by variation in the expression. However, emotion constancy is not without its limitations. For one, our ability to recognize the constancy of emotions amid variation in expressions is imperfect. Sometimes changes to expressions do alter the perception of their underlying mental states. Someone else might be quite convinced by Michael's changing expression after Imogen comes in and think he's just gotten over his disappointment pretty quickly. Through his smile, they now take him to be perfectly content. And this demonstrates that our capacity to recognize constancy can be greater or weaker across perceivers. We can capture this with the observation people often make that some can be more or less emotionally astute than others. And also, our ability to spot steadfast emotions often depends on the kinds of expressive changes in operation. For whatever social or biological reason, we tend to associate various facial configurations and bodily gestures with some emotions more than others. Smiles and laughs are often paired with happiness, as are grimaces with disgust. And these associations help us to categorize what other people feel. I'd have very little trouble tracking my friend's happiness if they progress from a smile to a laugh. But assuming that they are indeed happy throughout, I might have more trouble tracking this if their smile becomes a grimace. There's a sense in which our capacity for recognizing emotion constancy can be thrown off when unexpected expressions enter the mix. But interestingly, these limitations are also present in ordinary color constancy. As Hilbert points out, color constancy is imperfect. Imagine looking at the wooden table in a shop window as the sunlight shines through, throwing half of the table into shade. You think that it's a very interesting design that they varnished the wood differently on either side so that it takes on two colors. But as the light passes behind a cloud, you realize there's in fact no such color difference. The reality was just a failure of color constancy. And as with emotion constancy, our ability to spot constant colors can vary according to different perceivers. It's suggested that a lower ability to identify color constancy is associated with naive perceivers such as children. And Hardin writes, as an explanation of this variation, he says a rather high degree of constancy is, in general, evolutionarily advantageous because it significantly assists the animal to re-identify objects. And likewise, we might say that being emotionally astute is socially advantageous. Finally, limitations on color constancy can depend on differences in the particular perceptual medium in play. Just as we're used to certain expressions being associated with certain emotions, aiding our identification of them, we can be used to particular sources of light. I am used to the lamp emitting green light on my desk, and I tend to expect a certain change in appearance of the objects within its glow. I've got no trouble seeing my purple pen as purple, despite the green hue it now appears to have. But if I were to visit a desk which throws my purple pen under an unfamiliar blue light, I might have trouble identifying its purpleness and briefly mistake it for another pen. So it looks like, as well as our tracking of emotions being similar to our tracking of colors, the limitations on our abilities in each case interestingly mirror one another. And the take home from this for our purposes should be that in these phenomena, expressions and perceptual media seem to occupy the same role. Okay, so finally, and perhaps most importantly, we come to the question of whether expressions are transparent, or rather, are they transparent in our perception of emotions? And this is to say, do we see through expressions? Well, sometimes we talk as though we do. What do we mean when we say to someone, "You're so transparent"? Well, we usually mean that their real thoughts or feelings have been laid bare. And more often than not, this is in spite of an intention to conceal them. For instance, imagine asking the room who it was who ate the last of the biscuits you've been saving. Everyone in the room adopts a nonplussed expression, but you can see through your brother's expression to his evident guilt. And this seems to be the sort of situation in which we'd call another transparent. And what it's natural to take this to mean is that we can see straight through their expression to how they truly feel. And the fact that our language can represent expressions as transparent may at least lend some intuitive support to this perhaps bizarre suggestion. On the other hand, you might think it's a little strange. After all, the vehicles of expressions seem to be people's faces and bodies. In other words, expressions consist in opaque objects. We certainly seem to see them. But this is also true of many things that can be transparent. Windows are transparent. We see through, in, or out of them to what lies behind. But this doesn't mean that they cannot sometimes be opaque. We sometimes look at them as windows. For example, we might be admiring the windows on another person's house in the hope of adopting the same ones for our own. Oh, sorry. Back. And while we might be able to represent the distinct perceptible features of an expression, like in this picture, the same is also true of windows. Neither need always be transparent, but this doesn't rule out that they sometimes are. So, do expressions sometimes exhibit transparency? And to ask this is to say, are they present in our experience of the emotions in the following way? They'd need to be in the background of our awareness and deriving their character from the things we see through them. Now, appealing again to Haider, he thinks that sometimes they are. He thinks there are cases where the mediating factors in our social awareness are very obscure. He says, for instance, we may see that a person is displeased without being able to say just what about his appearance or behavior gave us that impression. This is very often true when the cues involve the interpretation of physiognomies, gestures, tone of voice, and similar expressive features. They often mediate personality traits, wishes, or attitudes of persons without our being able to say what the material is upon which we base our perceptions. Okay, so imagine again, as we did at the start, the speaker who was nervous to give a talk. They've now finished speaking and they're widely smiling with relief. Now there's a complex array of things happening on their face, contributing to their overall expression. And in this instance, one of them happens to be a smile. Now, if you're pushed to explain why you saw them as relieved rather than say happy, as smiles standardly display, I think it would be very difficult to explain this without reference to the relief itself. Their smile gets its character in virtue of being a smile of relief. Moreover, it would be difficult to explain since in many of our social interactions, we don't attend to the expressions of others. We interact on the basis of how others think and feel. We're wary of someone because they're angry and not merely because they're scowling. The scowl, of course, is part of our experience of them, but it's not our terminal focus, to use Haider's phrase. So, just as with our brightly lit desk, where we don't so much see the brightness, but rather things on the desk brightly lit. When expressions are highly transparent, we don't so much see expressions, but rather emotions expressed. Okay. But expressions are definitely not always highly transparent. And I will go back to the Haider quote that I read before. It continues. On the other hand, there are many occasions when we can quite precisely elucidate the mediating conditions for our perceptions of other people. Often the raw material consists of actions and reactions of the person that can be perceived in their own right and can be separated from the terminal focus. And Haider's quite right, I think, to point out that the extent to which expressions feature in our experience of another's emotion varies. While I may not be attuned to another's expression in some instances, there definitely are times when expressions come into the foreground. When someone explodes in a tirade of anger, for example, their physical behavior can be as much a part of my experience of them as their anger is. But this feature shouldn't really surprise us now, given what was said before regarding degrees of transparency. Illumination and sound aren't always perfectly transparent. For instance, with the example before, we see less well through light on a foggy day. So it seems that expressions share with perceptual media the feature that they're phenomenally present in our experience, but to varying extents. Okay, one thing in the discussion of transparency before was that we saw a rather particular phenomenon to occur. This is that as transparency of something decreases, as does our perceptual access to things perceived through or in that thing. In other words, the more we attend to the medium in and of itself, the less well we can perceive things through it. And the question is this sort of seesaw phenomenon true of emotional expression? What would need to be true is that the more we attend to expressions in and of themselves, the worse off our perceptual access to the emotions underlying them. Now, At a first glance, we might think that in fact, the opposite of this is true. The bigger the smile, the more likely it is that you're going to see happiness. We tend to think of expressions as aids to emotion perception, not distractions. You just can't miss someone's anger when they're kicking and screaming. It forces its way into your perceptual awareness. So I think there are two possible responses here. For one, we might think that this seesaw phenomenon is overstated when it comes to sound and illumination. It's not obvious that all cases of perceptual media being more obtrusive in our experience of an object renders its perception worse off. So imagine that you're trying out a new set of speakers at a friend's house. You put on a song that you know really well in order to see if the speakers really do improve the sound quality. When listening to the song, you're more attuned than you normally would be to how it sounds. You pick up on the subtle notes that are being projected, ones that you wouldn't normally hear, and you conclude that the new speakers really are very good. Now, in this case, the sound of the song is more obtrusive in your experience than it has been before. But you certainly wouldn't think that you heard the song less well. In fact, you heard it better. So here, increased phenomenal presence of the medium can enhance perception in much the same way that exuberant expressions can enhance emotion perception. A second, and I think promising response, is to point out examples in which the phenomenon does occur with respect to expressions and emotions. Again, what we need is a case where the more the expression features in one's experience, the less that emotion is in view. So imagine walking beside someone as they share with you details of an incident that's been playing on their mind. In expressing their remorse, they look off wistfully into the distance. And you're struck by the beauty of this expression, and in the process, you lose touch with their remorse in favor of attending to their expressive eyes. The aesthetics of expressions can often be a distraction from what underlies them. Perhaps it's telling that people often say, "I'm an ugly crier," as a way to alleviate the emotional weight of the situation. And likewise, part of why it must be so frustrating to be told you're cute when you're angry is that they've failed to focus on how you actually feel. Okay, so these responses show hopefully that we can sustain our analogy between perceptual media and expressions when it comes to their transparency. And this idea that expressions are transparent is really crucial in distinguishing the epistemic role expressions play in our knowledge of others' emotions. Perceptual intermediaries that I introduced right at the start are not conceived of as transparent. Our vision doesn't penetrate through them. We see their perceptible properties, and from this, somehow we perceive other things. These other things we perceive only indirectly. If expressions are transparent, then the perceptual access we're afforded to the emotions perceived through them is direct. We peer through expressions, they're penetrable, and they derive their character from the emotions that shine through. So at the start, I introduced 3 ways in which expressions operate in our coming to know about another's emotional state. The suggestion of there being evidence upon which we can infer the minds of others, or perceptual intermediaries upon which we can perceive the minds of others. And both of these options are incompatible with the idea that we have the direct object of our awareness is another's emotion. And I suggested a third option that is compatible. This is that we can think about expressions by analogy with illumination and sound, the perceptual media for vision and hearing. By thinking about the often neglected role of perceptual media in paradigmatic perception, we can press doubt on the idea that expressive mediation alone means that there must be an asymmetry between these paradigmatic cases and emotion perception. Perhaps the kind of mediation offered by expressions is just like that of perceptual media.